Hi, welcome to this video. We're going to look at the linguistic sign and its role in discourse. This is a video on Columbia School of Linguistics, and I would like to first begin with the rules of the game, if you want. So let me make these preliminary observations. In the first place, in our view, language is the reflection of the relation between language user and reality. This means that language is never an objective reflection of reality. It is the reflection of the vision the language user has on reality. So there's no one-to-one relationship between language and reality. Now, the explanation of linguistic facts are fundamentally to be found in the human being and not in reality, at least only indirectly. Of course, reality does influence the vision that human beings have on it, but the vision is created by the human being and not necessarily by reality. Another very important observation is that the basic element of language, in our view, is the linguistic sign and not the sentence. But we'll discuss that later. First, let me show you this image in which we have the speaker on top. We have the world, the reality on the bottom left side, and we have language on the bottom right side. Now, of course, there is a direct relation between the language user, the speaker, and the reality. And of course, the reality casts its image upon the language user, and the language user has a direct relation to language. But at the same time, we have to see that there is no direct relation between language and reality. So the relation between language and language structure and reality is always through the language user, through the speaker. If that is clear, then we can move on to the next point, the next important point, and that is the relation between the sign versus the sentence. Now let me show you two examples of Spanish in which we compare two sentences, dice que baila and dice que baile. In the first one, he or she says that he or she dances in indicative mood, which is shown by the final a in baila, as compared to dice que baile, where we see a final e in the which indicates the subjunctive mood in she says that he or she should dance. Now, in traditional grammar, you will find utterances like, well, there are two kinds of decir, two kinds of to say, in which the first one governs the indicative, whereas the second one governs the subjunctive mood. Now, this is all very counterintuitive because we don't see any difference between dice in 1a or in 1b. So the only observable difference is the one between a and e, the final verb form of to dance. Therefore, the difference between indicative and subjunctive mood should account for the difference in interpretation between 1a and 1b. So 1a and 1b don't constitute meanings in themselves, but the result of the difference of interpretation has to lie in the difference between indicative and subjunctive mood. Having set more or less our starting point, our rules, so to speak, now we can start to think about what are the basic principles of linguistic analysis within the theory, what we call human communication strategies. First, I will give you a list of them, and then we will see each member of the list, how it actually works out. So first we have the principle of egocentricity, then the principle of economy, which in itself consists of two sub-principles, the principle of minimal effort and the principle of optimal clarity. And then we have the principle of iconicity, and finally the principle of inferential complexity, the principle of selective attention and the principle of the composition of meanings and of avoidance of inferential complexity. Those are two sub-principles of the main one, inferential complexity. So let's start with the principle of egocentricity. Well, this principle implies that the speaker takes his own point of view as a basis for communication, and that fact is a determinative factor for linguistic structure. If you want to see some particular studies about it, I would like to send you to Zubin 1979, who has some clear proofs for this principle taken from German, the study of German. But from my own practice, I can tell you that, for example, when you take a text in first person from, say, Spanish, I work mainly in Spanish, and you compare the first person, the distribution of first person references in subject or object, direct object position, and you compare it to the third person, you will find a larger occurrence of first persons in subject position and third persons in direct object positions, relatively speaking. So that is evidence of this principle of egocentricity. But there are many more things you can predict because of this principle. Then there is the principle of economy. This principle, in terms of communication, may be defined as the wish to put as little as possible effort in order to reach maximum clarity in the communicated message. In other words, if a speaker can reach the same communication effect with lesser effort, he or she will do so. In other words, we speakers, we are lazy. If we can communicate with less effort, we will not cease to do so. Let's take these two sub-principles one by one to see where this balance goes. So let's first look at the principle of minimal effort. If a speaker can reach the same communicative effect with lesser effort, he or she will do so. In other words, if you can say something in 2 words or in 3, if the communicative effect is not very different, the speaker will choose 2. You can also see this in syllables. For example, in Spanish you have very frequent words like bolígrafo, which is a pencil, and when these pencils became more and more common, you would see that speakers would abbreviate these words to boli. Or with bicicleta, bicycle, which is abbreviated to bici because of the high frequency. The other thing which is very common in Spanish, and not only in Spanish, I'm sure it also happens in English, is the fact that people with names, with first names that have more than 1 syllable, tend to be abbreviated. We see the same in English. For example, Richard is generally abbreviated to Dick by friends and family. In other words, the people that use those words, those names very frequently, like my own. My full name is Robert, and I'm called Bob as a short version of Robert. So let's go on to the next one, the principle of optimal clarity. Speaker will try to be as clear as possible, but always within the limits of effort. I have a very interesting example from Spanish again. In Spanish we can have sentences like John sees the house, Juan ve la casa. When I invert the order, and I would say, which is possible in Spanish, I don't say la casa de Juan, because it would be a bit ambiguous, because la casa would be in the iconic place of the subject. In order to remedy this this possible ambiguity, what Spanish speakers do is put just a tiny little pronoun in order to avoid this ambiguity, changing this phrase into la casa la de Juan. And then all roles are clear, but there's just a minimal effort to make it unambiguous. Let's move on to the principle of iconicity. The principle of iconicity implies that in an unmarked situation where there is a choice between different options, speakers will opt for the most iconic variant. That is the one that corresponds most with the situation observed in reality. For example, it is very common that the events that occur in reality in language are presented in the same order as in reality. That is the result of this principle. So here we see that the structure of larger amounts of language in fact have a correlation with reality. But again, it is the speaker that determines it. So reality does have its influence on the linguistic structure, but it is the speaker that decides to do so. Let's move on to the principle of inferential complexity. this is a quite, as the title suggests, a quite complex principle. The principle of inferential complexity refers to the fact that speakers are capable of inferring an infinity of complex messages on the basis of a limited series of simple linguistic elements. We have again two sub-principles. The one of selective attention, which implies that language users produce and interpret only those differences that are clearly observable and ignore small differences, particularly when they lack clear communicative relevance. For example, I can pronounce any word 2 times, say language, and then I can say language again, and then I change my intonation, my tone, my pitch, my volume, etc., etc. But hearers ignore these differences in tone, in intonation, and they only hear what is relevant, which is the word language and its meaning. So the differences are ignored because we are physically incapable of pronouncing exactly in the same way any word. That is something that babies learn when they learn how to speak. At first, when I was a very young linguist, I always thought that babies, they would just receive a lot of sound and that they learn to distinguish the relevant differences in language. But research has shown that it's all the way around. Babies hear an enormous amount of differences, and what they learn is which differences are relevant and which ones are not. So, and there is very interesting research has been done on that, and that seems to be the case. The other side of this same coin is the composition of meanings. The total meaning of a set of morphemes is in itself another example of the principle of selective attention. Particular semantic aspects of the implicated morphemes that are irrelevant are simply ignored. We can see these phrases in 1a and 1b as examples of this. We see this composition of meanings of this, and then we can interpret this whole phrase as a particular interpretation in a given setting. So this is what we mean by a composition of meaning, and all other aspects that may not be relevant in a particular context are simply ignored. To conclude, language use is fundamentally an instance of behavior. Language is therefore a product of human behavior. Therefore, the human condition and human behavior are responsible for its form and structure. For empirical linguistics, because we are empiricists, it is a fundamental point to take the linguistic form serious. So what we see is what we get, and I think examples 1a and b are the best example. We take linguistic form serious, we take the linguistic signs serious, and that is why we kind of invoke the origin of the different interpretation in these final e's and a's. That is taking linguistic form serious. They tell us something, and now we as analysts should be aware of that and act accordingly. So this is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you like this video, click the thumbs up below. See you in the next video.